Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Welcome to another in our series, Jewish 101, a series for anyone interested in all things Jewish, beginning with what Judaism or Torah is all about, how the Jewish tradition views the world, embraces the world, and what and why the Jews engage in a host of observances and styles of living. I'm Mark Golub. Thank you so much for joining us again. And thank you for the wonderful emails you've been sending me with such kind things to say about Jewish 101 and with wonderful, wonderful insights and questions relating to the ideas we've been dealing with each week. And right now, we're focusing on one of the most sensitive and crucial issues philosophers and religious scholars and teachers have addressed really since forever: how one reconciles the existence of human suffering and evil inflicted on human beings either by nature or by man, with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God. It's the problem known as THEODICY, the problem of theodicy. And again, it deserves a great deal of attention and thought. Why does God permit innocent people, children, to suffer? And you know, we're taping this episode of Jewish 101 in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake that hit Haiti. The visuals we've seen on television of the destruction that's torn a country to shreds, the visuals are overwhelming, can bring one to tears. And there's a sense of the oneness of humanity out of this tragedy that links every soul to the survivors of the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, and which causes us to mourn with those who have lost loved ones among the tens and tens of thousands of dead. And in the face of a disaster like this earthquake, what should the response of the religious person be? What should the response of the believer be? What should the response of the Jew be? If the earthquake in Haiti raises these issues, it asks us, is the earthquake in some way God's fault? Does one blame God? Does one become angry with God? Does a disaster like this earthquake in Haiti challenge the existence of God? Or when human acts of unspeakable cruelty and inhumanity, the Shoah being the ultimate example of man gone bestially insane and given over to unimaginable evil, do cruelties of nature and man cause a person of faith, a person who feels a relationship to God, to lose faith, to doubt God's existence because it seems impossible for a real God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, to permit natural disasters such as the earthquake or the man-inflicted evil of the Holocaust to occur or endure. And of course, these kinds of questions are asked by Jews as well as by non-Jews. And there are people who believe in a God who is somehow responsible for everything that happens in the world. The Christian evangelist, for example, Pat Robertson, has claimed that the Haitian earthquake was a result of the Haitians' pact with the devil, and that God brought the earthquake as a punishment against Haiti for that pact. In other words, the earthquake was God's doing. And you may remember some years ago that the late Christian minister Jerry Falwell explained the disease of AIDS. AIDS was God's judgment inflicted upon homosexuals for their immorality. Again, that AIDS was God's doing. And sadly, even tragically, there were and even are some Jews who believe that the Holocaust was God's judgment being executed upon German Jewry for their extreme assimilation and their failure to observe the mitzvot, the commandments. So there are misguided people who believe everything in the world is God's doing, and therefore both natural and human evils are caused by God. And then there are those who blame God, not for bringing the horror, but for failing to prevent the horror and for permitting natural disasters and suffering to continue. And I want to give you an example. I received an email. It was a mass email I received from a Jewish source that expressed a sense of religious anguish in response to the earthquake in Haiti. I want to read to you part of that email. It has become very difficult to go to synagogue lately. Praying to God has become a real challenge. Seeing children buried under rubble and collapsed school buildings, and knowing that there are thousands and thousands more of them, makes it hard to speak to the Creator in a gentle tone of praise and thanksgiving. By now we know that thousands have died and millions have lost their homes and all that's dearest to them. An incredible disaster has happened, and it was wrought not by man, but by heaven. What religious person does not feel traumatized at such a moment? Who does not experience a moment of rebellion against the Lord of the universe? Who does not ask whether it is still possible to stay religious after such immense pain? That was written by a person who sees God as responsible in some way for the disaster. Now, on the one hand, if one is overwhelmed with the horror of human tragedy and human pain, if one empathizes deeply with the pain of one's fellow human beings, is brought to tears by the sight of children who've lost parents, who may be maimed for life. If one who witnesses a tragedy like this feels that some kind of cosmic injustice has been done, and that in the midst of this empathetic human response to the pain of others, one needs a poetic language with which to express real human emotions of anger and fury and helplessness and loss and fear, just to express those emotions, just to get them out of one's being. And if that poetic language takes the form of blaming God, as if the real God of this universe either was responsible for the horror or permitted the horror to exist. If this poetry is the way in which one finds a meaningful expression of human pain, then my own inclination is to remain philosophically, Jewishly silent. If such language is meant to be metaphoric, an emotional release, then I understand completely. One is not really blaming God. And by the way, there's an absolute tradition within Judaism, in Judaism, of man calling God to account. In the Jewish tradition, there's an understanding of this cry out of the depths of the human soul. In the midst of one's pain, one cries out to God in question, why don't you save me? Why don't you save them? Why don't you save the people I love? Why don't you stop the suffering of your people, of all people? And we saw this when we looked at the Midrash of the Noah story, where after the flood, Noah rails at God. How could you have wrought such destruction and death? It's part of the Jewish tradition to express in language the helpless frustration in the face of others' pain, as if there's a real God one could blame. And I would say one more thing, which I feel is very, very important. When one is in the presence of another who's experienced the loss of a loved one, or any kind of personal trauma or tragedy, that's not the time for philosophical lectures. It's not the time for Jewish 101. The appropriate response to anyone in pain is simply to be there for the other person, either in silence that somehow conveys both an empathy and a oneness, a solidarity, or sometimes there's words of simple, profound empathy, sympathy. I am so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just sorry that it's happened to you. Or sometimes it's with a hug, an embrace, by putting one's arms around this person in grief and holding as long and as tightly as one possibly can. It's just obnoxious to give advice or to offer philosophical reason to a person in grief. And any survivor has the right to feel and express any sense of anger or fury imaginable. The survivor gets a pass on anything said or felt. In the midst of pain and loss of the other, it's simply a time for comfort and love, not philosophical lectures. The question remains, however, outside of a moment of grief, if one wants to understand the worldview of the Jewish tradition, one has a right to ask, well, what do the rabbis teach about the real God of this universe? Has this God failed in some way when human beings suffer? Does the Jewish tradition present us with a God who, out of God's love for human beings, suspends the laws of nature and divinely intervenes in the world to save human beings from suffering, wrought either by nature or by man? And the answer is an overwhelming no. The Jewish tradition is replete with teachings that express a very different view of the world. The Jewish tradition holds that God never suspends the laws of nature and that God will not intervene, even to save human beings from suffering and disaster. As discomforting as that thought might be, no matter how much people would wish that God would, in some Greek deus ex machina way, drop down into our lives and make everything bad disappear. It's just not the Jewish view of the reality of the world, the reality of life, or of the challenge of life, or the wonder of life. And as we've seen after the flood, which God brought as a way of punishing evil in the Torah, putting an end to evil, after the flood, God says in the book of Genesis, I made a mistake. I, God, created human beings with both a Yetzer Tov, an inclination to good, and the Yetzer Hara, an inclination to evil. And now God says, I must live with human beings who sometimes will allow their Yetzer Hara to run wild. But people of righteousness must ultimately put a stop to the evil of others. And so at the end of the Noah story, God promises never to do it again, never to destroy the world again as a way of punishing man. And God promises to stay out of it. And similarly, at the Red Sea, when the children of Israel faced annihilation at the hands of the Egyptians, the rabbis create this midrash of Nachshon, where despite the miracle described in the Torah text, in the midrash, the Red Sea does not split until Nachshon, a human being, plunges into the sea. Tell the children of Israel to go forward, is the verse in the book of Exodus, used by the rabbis to create the story of Nachshon. God does not save by supernatural miracle, according to the rabbis. Human beings make miracles by responding to the God who is the ground of being, by responding to the divine command that we must free the enslaved, that we're responsible for the well-being of one's neighbor, to courageously confront every Red Sea, wrought by nature or by man, and to move forward, ultimately splitting seas for oneself and for one's fellow human beings. And I recognize that this understanding of God may prove inadequate for people who are in pain. It's not comforting for those who are suffering. It's not enough for those who must watch their loved ones suffer. One may ask, as some of you have asked in emails to me, such as Mark, who wrote me a wonderful email from Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and others of you, questions like, well, who needs a God who doesn't interfere? And what about people who are ill, seriously ill? What about praying to God for their healing? And after all, there's a formal prayer in Judaism, the Mishaberach, said in synagogues all over the world, asking God to heal a beloved. Isn't that asking for God to intervene in nature? To bring some form of miraculous, supernatural healing? And I recognize how complex this issue is of God's relationship to the events of the world. And I hope that by now you have enough of a sense of me to know that whenever I'm in the presence of someone whose loved one is suffering from serious illness, perhaps is near death, I would never begin to lecture them about God never suspending the laws of nature. And if someone says to me, would you pray for my beloved? My answer always is, of course. And do I include the Mishaberach prayer in my own congregational life? Yes, I do. But my understanding of the Jewish tradition is that the Mishaberach is not a form of supernatural medicine. The Mishaberach is a legitimate expression of human hope. All prayer is poetry of some kind. It's a poetic statement of human longing and a way of feeling that there is something one can do on behalf of a person that one loves and is in such pain. And I want to take this one step further. We do ourselves and our children an enormous disservice. And I believe we even risk blaspheming the Jewish tradition and the God of the Jewish tradition by suggesting that if one prays to God on behalf of someone who is ill, there is a real God in heaven who will really respond to such prayers. will really bring healing in response to a prayer. The notion that there's a God in heaven who looks down at two human beings in hospital beds side by side. And for one of those human beings, there are people praying. But for the other human being, there's no one praying. That there is a God who would save the person for whom others are praying, but would not save the person for whom no one is praying. Someone has no one to pray for them. God is going to let them suffer or die in a way that God won't, for a person who has someone praying for them. I find that notion hideous and blasphemous. And any Jewish institution, any school, any day school, any program which teaches Jewish children that if they pray for someone who is ill, that God will reward their prayers by healing the person for whom the prayers are said. Teaching this notion to children is hideous and a form of Jewish blasphemy. It is the most simplistic, childish, primitive notion of God imaginable, and it is not the Jewish view. If one understands that such prayers are an expression of human love for someone who is ill, if one understands such prayers are said because we desperately want our beloved to heal and survive, that there's nothing else we can do but express ourselves through prayer, then such a prayer is honest and legitimate. And when someone in a hospital hears that a Misha Berach was recited for them, it tends to bring them comfort. It makes them feel more loved, more cared for. But it's poetry. It's poetry. It's not supernatural medicine. There was a time I faced serious illness. And some people who cared for me very deeply, and they're not even Jewish, they lit candles for me in their church. And I thought that was a very lovely, loving thing for them to do. I appreciated how they wanted to express their feelings for me, their hopes for me, their desire that I heal and be well. But I appreciated what they did, not because I thought their candles in a church would carry some weight in heaven on my behalf. It was because I understood they were reaching out to me in the only way they could. And when I was ill, when any of my beloveds have been ill, I want what my Jewish tradition has taught me is critical to a healthy outcome. I want an extremely competent physician. I want the best doctor in the world. And if I were to pray at all, I would pray that the physician be moved by whatever his or her sense of the divine is, to do the best possible job he or she is capable of, and to be a medical nachshon, to be the agent of a medical miracle. Maimonides, the greatest of all Jewish legal scholars and philosophers, Maimonides, the Rambam, teaches, if one is ill and prays to God for healing without seeking medical help, one is a fool. You want healing? You go to a doctor. And don't miss the importance of this teaching by Maimonides. One might argue that if there's a real God who really does perform supernatural miracles, who does heal, then it would be most beneficial to rely on prayer for healing. And there are religious traditions, religious communities, which do teach that one never goes to a doctor, One never uses medicine. One relies on prayer for healing. Maimonides' response, you're a fool. And what's worse in Judaism than being a fool? There's a Jewish teaching that asks, what does it mean to pray to God for healing? And the answer, God created the human body in accordance with nature. There are times when the human body can heal itself. But there are also times when the body cannot heal itself. One prays to God that human beings, those in the medical profession, use medicines created out of nature to heal the sick, all of which God has created. And another of my favorite Jewish teaching comes from the 18th century Rabbi Baruch of Mezbich, who was asked why in a popular Jewish prayer God is called creator of remedies, and only then awesome in praises doing wonders. Creator of remedies, and then awesome in praises doing wonders, making miracles. And the answer? God does not want to be praised as the Lord of supernatural miracles. And so in the prayer, it begins with remedies, nature, medicine. Nature is introduced and put first. It is the natural order using God-given medicines that human beings are healed through the great doctors who serve us all. And through nature, everything is a miracle and a wonder. That's the Jewish answer. That's the Jewish mindset. Individual Jews may blame God for human suffering, may blame God for permitting an earthquake or for failing to protect people from the evil of other human beings. And some of you may have seen my interview with Michael Steinhardt, who insists that he is an atheist. And why is he an atheist? Because there's no way for him to reconcile the notion of the existence of God with the horror of the Holocaust. And I know there are many people who believe the Shoah puts the nail in God's coffin. And after the Shoah, there were many people, including many Jews, who wrote books about gods being dead after the Holocaust. But the truth is, only the most primitive, simplistic views of God are affected by the presence of evil and suffering in the world. The rabbinic understanding of God is that God never suspends the laws of nature, even to save human beings from suffering, for to do so would put an end to nature and would put an end to human moral freedom and choice. It's why we read in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses quotes God as saying, I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life. Don't take that line lightly. The rabbis took that verse in Deuteronomy very, very seriously. Choose life. Human beings have both the opportunity and the right to choose good or evil, life or death. That's why it is within the capacity of human choice to choose life. And each of us, according to the Jewish tradition, is responsible for our own well-being and for the well-being of our neighbors. When in the book of Genesis, Cain asks God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" the Jewish answer is a resounding, overarching, "Yes, of course you are. Of course you are." When human beings suffer, it is our responsibility to end the suffering. And to the rabbis, that is the responsibility placed upon us by God. Choose life by making choices that help other people, that bring miracles into the lives of other people. That's the fundamental answer of the Jewish tradition to the problem of theodicy. God didn't make the Holocaust. It was not God's role to stop the Holocaust. It was human beings' responsibility. I remember talking to Elie Wiesel once, and I said to him, "Do you blame God for the Holocaust?" And his answer was, "I blame human beings so much more. It was human failure that led to the Holocaust, and it was an army of human Nachshons which put an end to the Holocaust." And yet, yes, it took 6 million Jewish lives and tens of thousands of millions of other lives. This darkest night in human history. But in the end, it was 6 million and not 7, and not 8, and not 9, and not 12. Because human beings put an end to the Shoah. Human beings went forward, moved forward, and they created the miracles of life for all of us. In the Jewish tradition, God doesn't save. God inspires others, human beings, to save. Of course, as always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed on this edition of Jewish 101. Please email me or write me this week. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.